For a duration of 6 arduous years, she had consistently declined every invitation to engage him in a direct dialectic. Yet, on this specific evening, the opportunities for evasion had finally evaporated, leaving her with absolutely nowhere left to conceal herself. The Rune Araj Auditorium, nestled within the prestigious academic halls of Columbia University, is architecturally designed to comfortably accommodate a maximum capacity of 800 attendees, yet on this particular Thursday evening, in the latter days of October, the official headcount had swelled to 812, primarily because the fire marshal had made the prudent, instantaneous decision that denying entry to the fervent supporters of a sitting United States Congresswoman would likely precipitate a far more significant logistical crisis than the presence of a few supplementary folding chairs. The event bore the title, "The Future of the American Economy," a designation that served as a polite, academic euphemism for the reality that two individuals who had been metaphorically circling one another within the digital arena of social media for half a dozen years were finally destined to occupy the same physical space, simultaneously, with live amplification recording every syllable. The narrative trajectory of how this event came to fruition was relatively straightforward. The Congresswoman had committed to a town hall regarding economic policy at Columbia University 3 months prior. A logical engagement given that her congressional district was geographically adjacent, the visual optics were impeccable, and her announcement on Instagram had garnered 40,000 positive reactions in less than 60 minutes. The university administration, in a sudden surge of intellectual ambition that they would subsequently either celebrate as a triumph of discourse or deeply regret as a chaotic miscalculation, had extended an invitation to Shapiro to serve as the countervailing voice. The team representing the Congresswoman had attempted to withdraw from the engagement, yet the university's provost, via a correspondence that was leaked to the public within hours, firmly reminded the representative that a contractual obligation had been signed, and that the institution placed a high premium on the unencumbered exchange of ideas, leaving her effectively ensnared by the circumstances, a reality that was apparent to all observers. The Congresswoman arrived first, emerging from a black Suburban at the side entrance, flanked by a security detail of 3 staff members and a communications director who was already in the process of live tweeting the brief transit from the vehicle to the auditorium doors. She was attired in a pristine white blazer, layered over a burgundy blouse, accessorized with gold hoop earrings, and wore the facial expression of a woman who had dedicated the previous fortnight to preparing for a conversation she had arguably never desired to participate in. The auditorium welcomed her in the manner that a room filled with progressive university students typically welcomes Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is to say, with a standing ovation of such intensity that it seemed to vibrate the overhead lighting fixtures. She offered a wave, she smiled radiantly, and she pointed toward an individual in the 3rd row with that specific gesture politicians utilize to convey recognition, regardless of whether they actually know the person. She assumed her position at the left side of the stage, settling behind a table equipped with a microphone, a bottle of water, and a leather portfolio sufficiently thick to conceal either extensive policy notes or perhaps a short novel. Shapiro arrived exactly 11 minutes later, entering through the main doors alone, carrying absolutely nothing. No briefcase, no manila folder, no hydration vessel, and no written notes. He was dressed in a dark suit, paired with a white shirt, eschewing a tie, and wore a yarmulke that rested on his head, with the quiet permanence of a man who dons one daily and has never once entertained the notion of removing it. He stood 5 feet and 9 inches on a generous measurement, and the expansive nature of the auditorium stage had the effect of making him appear somewhat diminished in stature, as large stages often do to individuals who do not fill the space with expansive physical gestures. The applause that met his arrival could be charitably described as mixed. A small cluster of college Republicans, situated in the back right quadrant, clapped with vigor, while a handful of law students who were familiar with his podcast offered a polite acknowledgement, but the remainder of the room produced a sound reflective of 800 people, vacillating between silence and hostility, eventually settling on a low-frequency murmur that resembled the hum of a refrigerator possessing a political opinion. Shapiro appeared not to notice the reception, or if he did, he demonstrated no concern. He walked to his designated table on the right side of the stage, sat down, adjusted the angle of his microphone, and looked out at the audience with the calm, focused demeanor of a man who had been anticipating this precise moment for 2,190 days. Not that he was keeping a specific tally. The moderator, Dr. Sarah Chen, who served as the chair of Columbia's economics department, introduced both participants with the studied neutrality of an academic who had been explicitly instructed by the administration to maintain a facade of absolute nonpartisanship. She elucidated the format of the evening opening statements, followed by a moderated discussion, and concluding with audience questions, and then turned the floor over to the Congresswoman for the first remarks. The Congresswoman stood up. Strictly speaking, she did not need to, as the format permitted seated remarks, but she stood because she understood a fundamental truth about performance art that most politicians learn far too late in their careers. One does not shift public opinion while remaining seated. She began by thanking the university, her voice carrying the practiced warmth developed over 1,000 previous town halls, stating that she was present that night because she believed in a simple premise, that the wealthiest nation in the history of human civilization possessed the financial capacity to care for its populace. She proclaimed her belief that health care is a fundamental right rather than a privilege, that education should not lead to financial ruin, that the climate crisis is a tangible reality, and that there exists a moral obligation to take action. She paused for effect before continuing, reminding the audience that she had worked as a bartender for 4 years prior to standing on the floor of Congress, asserting that she understood the visceral experience of working a double shift and still failing to meet rent obligations, and that she knew the anxiety of praying a tooth would not break due to an inability to afford dental care. She emphasized that she had not read about struggle in a policy paper, but rather, she had lived it. The audience erupted in approval, the standing ovation returning with fervor, and she resumed her seat with the impeccable timing of someone who knew exactly how long to allow the applause to crest before it began to recede. Shapiro waited for the room to return to a state of order. He did not stand, but instead leaned into his microphone with the posture of a man who was about to articulate something significant and wished to ensure every syllable was received with clarity. He addressed her directly, stating that he had been attempting to facilitate this conversation for 6 years, causing the room to fall quiet, not merely silent, but quiet with the hum of intense attention. He recalled that in 2018, he had offered $10,000 to her campaign or a charity of her choice for merely 1 hour of her time for a conversation, noting that her response had been to characterize his invitation as catcalling, essentially comparing a request for a policy discussion to sexual harassment on a street corner. He paused, not for dramatic effect, but for precision, before expressing his satisfaction that they had upgraded from catcalling to a formal town hall and promised to adhere to his best behavior. A ripple of laughter moved through the auditorium, unexpected and involuntary. The type of laughter that escapes before one's political allegiances can suppress it. Even some of the progressive students in the front rows found themselves covering their mouths. Shapiro's expression remained unchanged, as he stated that he was not there to destroy anyone, noting that the internet already contained sufficient destructive content, but rather he was there to ask a single question. Does the math work? He allowed the question to hang in the air, explaining that if the goal is to reshape the American economy and fundamentally alter how 330 million people live, work, and pay taxes, the numerical figures must align. He acknowledged that while feelings are important, he possesses them, she possesses them. Everyone in the room possesses them. Feelings do not balance budgets. Feelings do not fund government programs, and feelings do not place food on tables. He sat back, reiterating the question of whether the richest country in history can afford to care for its people, and suggested they find out through the application of mathematics. The room did not yet realize it, but they had just witnessed the final moment in which the Congresswoman would maintain control of the conversation. Dr. Chen directed the first topic toward energy and climate policy, a polite academic phrasing for the Green New Deal without utilizing the specific nomenclature that would cause half the audience to cheer and the other half to groan. Shapiro spoke first, announcing his intention to do something that might surprise the audience. He was going to agree with the Congresswoman. Her eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, a gesture that, in political body language, is the equivalent of a startled double-take. Shapiro affirmed that climate change is real and that human activity contributes to it, stating he would not debate the existence of the phenomenon as that was not the purpose of the evening. He leaned forward to clarify that the evening's purpose was to determine whether the Green New Deal, her signature policy introduced in 2019 and campaigned upon for 6 years, could actually solve the problem, noting that wanting to fix something and being capable of fixing it are two distinct concepts. He drew an analogy to wanting to dunk a basketball, which did not imply he possessed the ability to do so. A chuckle emerged from the audience at Shapiro, standing 5'9", making a height joke at his own expense. It was disarming and calculated to be precisely so. He proposed looking at the numbers, not his numbers, not Fox News numbers, not Daily Wire numbers, but those from the American Action Forum, a center-right policy institute, which he granted was conservative, but staffed by actual economists. They estimated the Green New Deal would cost between $51 trillion and $93 trillion over 10 years. He held up his hands, anticipating the counter-argument that it was a right-wing think tank, and agreed to use the low end of $51 trillion to be generous. He then began ticking off facts with the ease of someone cracking their knuckles. The total gross domestic product of the United States, everything the country produces in a year, every hamburger sold, every car built, every surgery performed is approximately $28 trillion, meaning her plan at its cheapest estimate would cost almost twice what the entire American economy produces in a year. He continued, noting that federal revenue, all the taxes the government collects from every person and corporation, is about $4.4 trillion per year, meaning her plan would cost more than 10 years of total federal revenue that is already allocated for the military, Social Security, Medicare, roads, schools, and everything else the government currently undertakes. He paused, not for long, as Shapiro did not utilize long pauses, but just enough for the magnitude of the numbers to register. He then introduced what he called the fun part. If one were to tax every single billionaire in America at 100%, not a higher rate, but taking every dollar they possess, the collection would amount to approximately $4.5 trillion, which would cover about 5 to 8% of her plan. And then, having rendered the billionaires broke, the question remained, what does one do in year 2? The Congresswoman had been waiting for an opening and seized it, accusing him of using inflated estimates from a conservative think tank to provide his figures. Shapiro responded without raising his voice, noting that she had introduced the plan in 2019 and it was now 2025. After 6 years, he asked for her cost estimate, inquiring specifically how much the Green New Deal costs according to her. The auditorium fell quiet in a manner that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with curiosity. 800 people leaned forward, waiting for a number. She did not have one. She began to speak about the cost of inaction, to which Shapiro retorted that the cost of inaction is not a number, but a bumper sticker. He pressed again, stating that she had 6 years and surely someone on her staff owned a calculator, pointing out that the cost would depend on specific implementation timelines, concluding flatly that she did not know. He remarked that she had been selling this plan to the American people for 6 years without knowing its cost, drawing a parallel to walking into a car dealership where, upon asking the price of a vehicle, the salesman replies that the cost of not buying the car is much higher. He asserted he would leave the dealership and would be correct to do so. He shifted forward, adding that the situation was even more problematic because her original Green New Deal resolution, the one posted on her official website with her name and logo, included a line about providing economic security for all who are unable or unwilling to work, emphasizing the word unwilling. Her expression tightened as she claimed it was a draft document released prematurely by a staffer. Shapiro countered that it was on her website, under her name and official congressional seal, arguing that if his producer accidentally posted a document on the Daily Wire claiming support for abolishing the Second Amendment, he would not call it a premature draft, but a firing offense, and the document would still have existed. He turned to the audience, addressing the students directly, explaining that he was not arguing against clean energy or environmental protection, but against a plan that possessed no cost estimate, no feasible funding mechanism, and included in its original form a promise to pay people who do not wish to work. His voice dropped half a register as he stated that the people hurt by such plans are not the ones on stage. She makes $174,000 a year, and he does fine, but rather the working families whose energy bills double when fossil fuels are eliminated in a decade, the small business owners unable to absorb new regulations, and the factory workers whose jobs disappear. He looked at her, noting that she constantly speaks of the working class and brands herself as their champion. Yet her policies would devastate them, not in theory but in practice, citing Germany's aggressive green energy transition, which saw electricity prices triple, and Sri Lanka's attempt to go fully organic overnight, which triggered a food crisis that collapsed the government. He concluded that the road to economic hell is paved with good intentions, and the Green New Deal isn't even paved. It is a trail of Instagram posts leading into a forest with no map. Her communications director in the front row was typing furiously, though whether crafting a rebuttal or updating a resume remained unclear. Shapiro continued, stating that the Green New Deal was just the beginning, and proposed discussing what happens when slogans meet mathematics. Dr. Chen introduced the topic of tax policy and income inequality, which Shapiro received with the restrained enthusiasm of a fastball pitcher receiving a soft lob. He began by recounting that in 2021, the Congresswoman attended the Met Gala, an annual fundraiser in New York City, where the wealthiest individuals pay $35,000 per ticket to dress in costumes and photograph one another. He noted she wore a white gown with "Tax the Rich" written on the back, designed by Aurora James, who at the time owed approximately $13,000 in unpaid taxes. He let that fact land. A congresswoman attended a party for the ultra-wealthy, wearing a dress made by a woman who doesn't pay her taxes, with the dress itself saying, "Tax the Rich," and furthermore, the House Ethics Committee had found she violated rules by accepting gifts she didn't properly pay for, requiring her to pay an additional $3,000. Shapiro looked at the audience with theatrical bewilderment, remarking that he couldn't write satire this good. If he pitched it as a Saturday Night Live sketch, it would be rejected for being too on the nose. Laughter rippled through the room, louder than before, crossing political lines, as comedy is bipartisan when the setup is sufficiently absurd. She leaned into her microphone, asserting she used that platform to bring a message about economic inequality to those who benefit most from it. Shapiro countered that the dress started a national conversation about her, not tax policy or inequality. It was about her appearance at the Met Gala, starting a news cycle that ended 15 minutes later when the next celebrity wore something strange. He shifted gears, the sarcasm receding to reveal the focused intensity of a Harvard Law graduate, constructing a load-bearing argument. He addressed the policy of tax the rich, calling it a great slogan that fits on a dress or a tweet, but questioning if it fits on a spreadsheet. He started counting. She proposed a 70% marginal tax rate on income over $10 million, which would generate approximately $72 billion per year. He noted the federal deficit is $1.7 trillion, meaning her $72 billion covers about 4% of the gap. He held up four fingers. He then proposed a theoretical 100% tax on every billionaire homes, stocks, yachts, everything collecting about 4.5 trillion once. Because afterwards, they are broke. Since federal spending is 6.2 trillion per year, that confiscation funds the government for about 9 months. He turned to her, genuinely asking for the answer beyond the slogan, she needs 3.2 trillion per year for Medicare for all alone. Where does it come from? She responded with practiced fluency about redirecting military spending, closing corporate loopholes, and implementing a financial transactions tax. Shapiro began adding it up on his fingers. Military spending is $886 billion, so cutting it in half, unlikely to pass Congress, yields $443 billion. Closing every corporate loophole might get $600 billion. A financial transactions tax might yield $200 billion on an optimistic day. He summed it up aloud. 443 plus 600 plus 200 equals 1.2 trillion. She needs 3.2 trillion for health care alone, leaving her 2 trillion short, without even starting on free college, guaranteed jobs, or the Green New Deal. His voice accelerated, the logical structure tightening, stating that the money always comes from the middle class because there are never enough rich people. He cited Scandinavia, noting Sweden's top marginal rate kicks in at $60,000, which is not taxing the rich, but taxing the waitress. Her prepared responses were running out, visible in the way her hands moved toward her portfolio, as if the answers were inside it, rather than within her. She began to say other countries manage to provide universal health care and education. Shapiro challenged her to name one country with 330 million people, an $11 trillion military commitment, and current entitlement spending levels that also provides free health care, college, guaranteed jobs, and zero carbon emissions. He waited, saying he had time. The silence lasted 4 seconds. A lifetime in a debate. Enough time for everyone to realize she could not name one because it does not exist. And the countries that tried versions of it, like Venezuela or the Soviet Union, are not vacation destinations. He leaned back, noting that numbers are cold. So he proposed talking about honesty, shifting his tone from machine gun delivery to a different texture, moving from policy to character. He wanted to show a pattern to the audience, beginning with the border in 2018. He described photographs of her gripping a chain-link fence in Tornado, Texas, tears streaming down her face, images that went viral and defined her as a compassionate fighter. However, he pointed out that other photos from the same event showed she was standing at a fence along an access road, with the detention facility not visible from her location. He asked if she was upset about policy. Likely, yes. Were children in bad conditions? Absolutely. Were her emotions real? Perhaps. But he insisted the staging was deliberate. distinguishing between feeling something and producing something, arguing that if one performs compassion instead of practicing it, the people claimed to be cared for become content rather than a cause. She cut in, stating she was genuinely devastated. He acknowledged that, but emphasized she chose the angle, the fence, and the tears through the chain link. She didn't stumble upon a moment. She directed one. He moved to January 6, 2021, condemning the event unequivocally, which surprised the progressive students. He then recounted her Instagram Live where she described a near-death experience, hiding in her office, hearing pounding, believing she would die. He noted she was in the Cannon Building, across the street, and separate from the Capitol. While the building was evacuated, her colleague Nancy Mace, on the same floor, called the account exaggerated. Shapiro distinguished between a factual description of an evacuation and an Instagram narrative of a near-death experience. He built the pattern. Order photo staged, January 6th. Narrated, Met Gala costumed. Kitchen Instagram Lives produced all for maximum engagement. He called her the most talented political performer of her generation, a genuine compliment on her branding, but argued that performance is not governance, followers are not legislation, and crying on camera does not feed a hungry child. She leaned forward, her voice carrying unrehearsed heat, accusing him of sitting behind a microphone, criticizing those who actually do things, noting he had never run for office, written a bill, or received a call at 2 a.m. from a constituent needing insulin. The audience roared, seeing the fiery AOC they expected. Shapiro waited for the wave to exhaust itself, before acknowledging he is a commentator who talks for a living. But he retorted by asking what she had done in 6 years in Congress. What major legislation with her name on it had been signed into law? He listed her failures: Green New Deal, 0 votes, Medicare for all, never reached the floor, and a stock trading ban. He noted she has 8.5 million Twitter followers and appears on magazine covers. Yet her major legislative accomplishment is a stock trading ban that hasn't passed. He told the audience that a business with that ratio of marketing to product would be bankrupt. Then, Shapiro did something unscripted. He told her she was right about the stock trading ban. The room froze. He stated members of Congress should not trade individual stocks, agreeing with her and the Restore Trust in Congress Act. Noting Nancy Pelosi was wrong to resist it, he showed the audience that agreeing with a Democrat didn't cause him physical pain. He explained that he agreed because the ban was based on facts and logic. A real corruption problem with a workable solution, devoid of trillion-dollar fantasies. He expressed frustration that this proved she could identify problems and propose practical solutions, possessing the talent and platform to do so. Yet she chose to sell fantasies like the Green New Deal instead, because fantasies get more likes than spreadsheets. She tried to claim he acknowledged they agreed on more than he admitted. He shot back that going 1 for 40 would get a baseball player cut from a Little League team. But in Congress, it makes one the future of the Democratic Party. The audience laughed, a massive, involuntary release of tension. She tightened her jaw and took a sharp sip of water. Shapiro then dropped the sarcasm entirely, his posture softening, his hands going still. He spoke with a vulnerability the audience had never heard, admitting he is not great at personal but wanted to be honest. He described his life as an Orthodox Jew, keeping Shabbat, turning off phones, sitting with his family. He spoke of his wife, a doctor who spent years in training and works exhausting hours yet helps their children with homework. His voice trembled slightly as he said that when she says tax the rich, she isn't talking about Jeff Bezos, who has lawyers and offshore accounts. She is talking about his wife, who works 80 hours a week, pays student loans, and tries to save. She is talking about the small business owner in the Bronx, The guy with the bodega working from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. Or the immigrant family with a laundromat in Queens. He argued these people aren't rich, they are trying, and her policies punish them for it. The auditorium went church silent. He spoke of his grandparents coming to America with nothing, surviving horrors he wouldn't describe, working in factories so their grandson could graduate from Harvard Law. He declared that America, not a government program, gave them the freedom to build something. He turned to her, stripped of debate tactics, arguing that democratic socialism gets in people's way with regulation and control, hurting those trying to climb the ladder. He said promising free everything teaches people they are helpless without the government, characterizing it not as compassion, but as a cage with nice wallpaper. He reminded her she is from the Bronx and has seen dependency trap people for generations, yet she wants more of it because it sounds compassionate and goes viral. He concluded that facts don't care about feelings, but more importantly, feelings don't pay rent. The room sat in silence for 7 seconds, processing the dismantling of the performance to reveal the reality underneath. Dr. Chen called for the final segment. AOC stood up, not with the politician's practiced rise, but with the instinctive reaction of a fighter who has been hit and chooses to hit back. She challenged his definition of personal, recounting her life 4 years prior, standing behind a bar, pouring drinks for men in suits, working doubles, taking the subway at 2 a.m., drowning in student debt, losing her father to cancer, and nearly losing their home to medical bills. Her voice hardened as she stated she didn't have a Harvard degree or a platform, just black, non-slip shoes and hope. She pointed at him, criticizing his lecture from the comfort of his media empire, declaring she was the working class and had lived the struggle. The audience erupted, the progressives leading a standing ovation that filled the room with the accumulated tension of the night. She continued over the applause, speaking of skipping meals to make rent and the choice between a doctor and a phone bill, asserting she fights for these policies because a 23-year-old bartender somewhere in the city deserves better than a podcast host, telling her the math doesn't work. She sat down with fierce satisfaction. Shapiro did not move, waiting for the applause to fade with the patience of a veteran debater who knows the opponent is most vulnerable right after their strongest punch. When silence returned, he acknowledged that everything she said was true. Her struggle, her hard work, her pain, her rise from bartender to congresswoman were all real. He nodded with genuine respect. But then he asked the question that carried weight and teeth. She made that journey in the United States, in a free market economy, under the constitutional system she wants to restructure. She didn't need the Green New Deal or socialism. She needed opportunity, and this imperfect capitalist America gave it to her. The silence deepened. He asked why she is trying to dismantle the system that made her story possible, replacing the ladder she climbed with an escalator designed by bureaucrats, telling the next bartender she can't do it herself. He leaned forward, declaring that she, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is the single best argument against her own policies, living proof that free markets and liberty create more opportunity than any socialist program. Her story refutes her ideology. Every victory she achieved happened because America gave her the freedom to earn it. The trap was perfect because it was true. She couldn't refute it without denying her own life. Shapiro concluded quietly that she is not the future of the Democratic Party, but the future of the American story, proof that the system works, but only if she stops trying to replace it with one that has never worked anywhere. Dr. Chen called time. The response was a fractured sound of 800 people processing complex emotions. AOC gathered her things, shook Dr. Chen's hand, and after a pause for the cameras, shook Shapiro's hand firmly. She left with her staff. Shapiro sat for a moment, then left alone through the main exit. The clip of the final exchange hit 50 million views before midnight. By Friday, it was the most shared video. By Saturday, translated into 14 languages. By Sunday, the subject of countless contradictory think pieces. The New York Times fact-check found Shapiro's numbers substantially accurate, though they wished otherwise. AOC posted a 19-minute Instagram response, addressing the feelings and emotional toll, satisfying her base, but leaving the math questions unanswered for the broader public. Shapiro recorded his podcast the next day, treating the debate as just another Tuesday, praising her talent but maintaining she was wrong on the numbers. In a viral phone clip, he told a producer that nobody wins a debate. One just hopes the truth does. That Friday evening, the Shapiro household observed Shabbat, turning off the digital world to light candles and eat dinner. When his 7-year-old daughter asked who won, he repeated that nobody wins, a sentiment she found unsatisfactory. As the candles burned and New York City hummed with energy, a 23-year-old bartender in the Bronx closed down her bar. She had watched the clips, unsure who won, but she was thinking about the question of the ladder and the escalator, and whether the system that allowed a bartender to become a congresswoman was worth preserving. She didn't have an answer yet, but she was thinking, and in America, that is how everything starts.